Elijah Carter stepped onto the plane with quiet anticipation. His sneakers squeaking faintly against the polished floor of the jet bridge. He was a boy of 15. But his calm demeanor and composed posture suggested a maturity beyond his years. His collared shirt was neatly pressed. His jeans spotless. And he carried a small backpack that looked more functional than fashionable. To an observer, he might have seemed like any other young traveler, though the brightness in his eyes betrayed a spark of excitement. This was no ordinary trip. For Elijah, this was a reward, a celebration of his hard work and academic achievements. His father, Dr. Nathan Carter, had insisted on booking him a first-class seat. A gesture to show how proud he was. "You deserve to experience the best, son," his father had said. His deep voice tinged with pride. "Never forget that you've earned your place, no matter where life takes you." Elijah had taken those words to heart as he boarded the plane. Boarding pass clutched tightly in his hand. The first-class cabin was a world unto itself. An island of spacious seats and hushed luxury. Elijah found his row, stowed his backpack neatly, and sank into the oversized leather seat. He couldn't help but run his fingers over the smooth armrests, marveling at the sheer comfort. Flying had always been an adventure. But this was something else entirely. He pulled out a paperback novel from his bag, its pages slightly worn from eager reading. Settling in, he began to read. The hum of the aircraft around him fading into the background. There was a quiet pride in his chest. Not the boastful kind, but a steady warmth that came from knowing his efforts had brought him here. A few minutes passed before a figure appeared at the front of the cabin. Clara Mitchell, the senior flight attendant, made her way down the aisle with the practiced authority of someone who had spent decades in the skies. Her uniform was immaculate, her posture stiff, and her gaze sharp as it swept over the passengers. She stopped mid-stride when her eyes landed on Elijah. There was no reason for her to linger. No protocol requiring her to question his presence. Yet, something about Elijah, his youth, his quiet confidence seemed to catch her off guard. Her frown deepened as she approached him. "Excuse me, young man," she said. Her voice professional but edged with a subtle note of doubt. "May I see your boarding pass?" Elijah looked up from his book. Startled but polite. "Of course, ma'am," he said, handing her the ticket. She studied it for a moment, her brow furrowing. The pause stretched longer than it needed to. "This is a first-class seat," she said, her tone more statement than question. "Yes, ma'am," Elijah replied evenly. "My dad booked it for me." Clara's lips pressed into a thin line as she handed the ticket back. "Enjoy your flight," she said curtly before walking away. But the stiffness in her step and the way her eyes lingered on him hinted that this interaction was far from over. Elijah tried to return to his book, but the encounter left him unsettled. He thought of his father's advice, given during countless late-night talks: stay calm. Show strength through composure, not anger. He let out a slow breath and turned the page, willing the words to anchor him. Around him, the other passengers seemed oblivious, their attentions buried in newspapers and tablet screens. Yet the air felt heavier. A quiet tension threading through the cabin like a low hum only Elijah could hear. As the plane began to fill, he reminded himself why he was there: not to prove anything, not to draw attention, but simply to enjoy the reward he had earned. The first class was meant to feel like a sanctuary. Yet even in its spacious comfort, the faint shadow of doubt cast by a glance, a tone, an unspoken assumption was impossible to escape. Elijah sat a little straighter in his seat, his hands steady on the book. He didn't know it yet. But this flight would test not only his patience but his understanding of what it meant to claim his place in a world that didn't always want to see him there. 4-0. Ban de Noi. Bang Tiang on Viet Chuang Tu Hap Dan Quan Hut Nuoi Doc Bang Jong Van Tram Lang. Kok Quan, Jong Van Qua Ka Chien Kong Qua Kich Tin Ma Ko Fan Ben Nan. Tram Lang. Nan Man Su Mao Thuan Gam Qua Van De Fan Beat Chung Tok Trong Doi Song Hong Gay Doi Tuong Nuoi Ne La Nuoi Sin Song Tai Mai Va Ko Du Tuoi Trend 65 Tuoi. ChatGPT de Noi. ChatGPT. Chapter 2, The Interruption. The cabin settled into the familiar rhythm of a flight preparing for takeoff. Elijah leaned back in his seat, allowing the faint murmur of conversations and the occasional clink of glassware to form a soft backdrop to his reading. Outside the window, the runway stretched endlessly, a reminder of the journey ahead. He tried to focus on the words in his book, but his thoughts wandered back to the flight attendant's questioning gaze. It wasn't the first time he'd been on the receiving end of such scrutiny, though it never stopped feeling out of place. He had always been taught to meet those moments with calmness, to answer politely and wait for the moment to pass. But the lingering discomfort Clara Mitchell's tone had left behind stayed with him, like the faint scent of smoke after a flame is extinguished. The hum of the engines grew louder as the plane began to taxi. And for a while, everything seemed to settle. Elijah's heartbeat matched the rhythm of the aircraft, steady and unbothered. Yet, as soon as the plane reached cruising altitude, Clara returned, her presence marked by the sharp click of her shoes on the aisle floor. She stopped at Elijah's row and leaned slightly toward him, her face composed but her eyes sharp with a flicker of doubt. "Mr. Carter," she began, her voice clipped but professional. "I need to speak with you for a moment. Could you follow me to the galley?" Elijah blinked, his confusion evident but controlled. "Is there a problem?" he asked. "I just need to clarify something about your ticket," she replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. Around them, heads turned subtly, the curiosity of nearby passengers like a whisper Elijah couldn't hear but could certainly feel. He stood, placing his book carefully on the seat, and followed her without protest. His footsteps were measured, his posture straight. Inside, unease churned, but his outward calm never wavered. He knew better than to appear defiant. The galley was tucked away, a cramped space filled with the faint smell of brewed coffee and reheated meals. Clara turned to face him, crossing her arms tightly, her stance firm. "I need to move you to the main cabin," she said, her words delivered with the certainty of someone issuing a command. Elijah frowned slightly. "Why? My ticket is valid. I'm in the seat my father booked." Clara's gaze hardened. "This seat isn't appropriate for you," she said, her tone low but unyielding. "I'll need you to cooperate." Elijah's father's voice echoed in his memory, a steady reminder, "When they push, stand tall. But do it with grace." He straightened his back. "Ma'am, I don't understand. If there's a mistake, I'd like to see it." Clara's expression tightened, a flicker of irritation crossing her face. "I don't have time to argue. Either you move now, or I'll involve security." There was no shouting, no raised voices. The galley remained quiet, the tension hanging in the air as thick as fog. For a moment, Elijah considered refusing outright. But he knew how this might look to the other passengers, the ones craning their necks to glimpse what was happening. He knew how quickly calm conversations could turn into something else entirely. Without another word, he nodded. "All right," he said, His voice steady. Lead the way. As they walked back to the economy cabin, Elijah kept his head high. The whispers of the passengers followed him like an unwelcome chorus. And he imagined their thoughts. The questions lingering in their minds. Was he in the wrong? Did he deserve this? He reached his new seat. Cramped and far less inviting. And sat down. The flight attendant disappeared back toward the front of the plane without another glance. Elijah retrieved his book from his backpack. But for once, the words didn't hold his attention. He pulled out his phone and typed a quick message to his father. They moved me to economy. Said my seat wasn't valid. Can you check? His father's reply came almost instantly. Sit tight. Son. I'll handle it. Elijah placed the phone back in his bag and stared out the window. The clouds outside were serene. Unbothered by the chaos of the world below. In that moment, he resolved to do the same. Let others see what they wanted to see. Judge how they would judge. He would hold his composure. Even as his dignity was quietly chipped away. In the distance, the faint chime of the intercom signaled an update from the cockpit. For now, the flight carried on. A vessel moving forward even as the weight of unspoken tensions pressed down on one of its passengers. Elijah tightened his grip on his book. Turning the page despite not having read the last. 4-0. Ban de Noi. Bang Tiang on Viet Chuang 3 Hap Dan Quan Hut Nuoi Doc Bang Jong Van Tram Lang. Kok Quan, Jong Van Qua Ka Chien Kong Qua Kich Tin Ma Ko Fan Ben Nan. Tram Lang. Nan Man Su Mao Thuan Gam Qua Van De Fan Beat Chung Tok Trong Doi Song Hong Gay Doi Tuong Nuoi Ne La Nuoi Sin Song Tai Mai Va Ko Du Tuoi Trend 65 Tuoi. ChatGPT de Noi. ChatGPT. Chapter 3, A Moment of Injustice. The economy cabin hummed with quiet activity as Elijah settled into his new seat. The space was cramped. The seat narrower than he was used to. And the tray table in front of him bore the marks of many flights, small scratches and faint stains that spoke of countless travelers before him. He placed his backpack beneath the seat. His movements deliberate. And tried to focus on the steady rhythm of the plane. Around him, passengers cast sidelong glances. Most quickly looked away when his gaze met theirs. Their curiosity concealed by an abrupt return to their books. Screens. Or conversations. Others whispered to their seatmates. Their faces turned just enough to let him know they were speaking about him. Elijah wasn't sure if it was pity, judgment, or simply confusion that filled the space between their words. But the weight of their stares lingered. He opened his book, forcing himself to concentrate. The words swam in front of him. Their meaning lost in the fog of his thoughts. His father's reply had reassured him, I'll handle it, but it didn't erase the sting of humiliation he felt. He hadn't done anything wrong. That much he knew. And yet, here he was. Displaced. Quietly trying to make sense of a situation that shouldn't have happened. Elijah had always understood. In a way that was both too early and too necessary. That people sometimes saw what they wanted to see. He was aware of how his presence could unsettle others. Though he never fully understood why. Sitting here now. Surrounded by strangers who saw only the aftermath of what had occurred. He felt that awareness sharpen. Like a thorn pressing just beneath the surface. Back in the first-class cabin. Clara Mitchell moved briskly down the aisle. Her demeanor unchanged. To the untrained eye, she was the picture of efficiency. Carrying out her duties with practiced ease. But to Robert Greene, the senior flight attendant, there was something in her movements too quick. Too rehearsed that gave him pause. He watched her carefully. His years of experience telling him that something was amiss. "Clara," he called softly as she passed him in the galley. His tone was gentle but firm. The kind that invited honesty without accusation. "A word?" She hesitated but stepped closer, crossing her arms defensively. "What is it?" "What happened with the young man you moved?" he asked, keeping his voice low to avoid drawing attention. "I noticed you brought him back to economy. Was there an issue with his ticket?" Clara's expression stiffened. "It didn't feel right," she said. Her words clipped. "He didn't belong in first class." Robert tilted his head slightly, studying her. "Didn't belong," he repeated. "Clara. You've been doing this job long enough to know feelings aren't a reason to move a passenger. Was there something wrong with his boarding pass?" She shifted uncomfortably, her gaze darting past him. I wasn't sure. I've seen situations like this before." "Like what?" Robert pressed, his voice calm but unwavering. Clara's eyes finally met his. "Sometimes people end up where they're not supposed to be," she said. "I was trying to avoid a bigger issue." Robert's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone even. "And now we might have one," he said quietly. "If his ticket was valid, and I'm guessing it was, you've not only embarrassed him but put yourself and this airline in a very difficult position." Clara opened her mouth to respond, but the phone in the galley rang sharply, cutting her off. Robert picked it up, his expression unreadable as he listened. He handed the phone to Clara after a moment, his gaze steady. "It's the executive office," he said simply. Clara's face paled as she took the receiver. Her voice, usually firm, faltered as she spoke. "Yes. This is Clara Mitchell. I understand." "No. Of course. I'll file the report upon landing." She hung up slowly, her hand lingering on the receiver as if hoping the conversation could have gone differently. Without another word, she walked away, her posture less certain than before. In the economy cabin, Elijah remained silent, his eyes fixed on the clouds outside the window. The landscape below seemed so far away, peaceful and untouched by the quiet turmoil inside the plane. He thought about his father's words about how strength wasn't always about fighting back but about standing firm in the face of adversity. He didn't need to shout or demand answers, his calmness was its own kind of defiance. What he didn't know, at least not yet, was that this moment would ripple far beyond this flight. Quiet acts of resilience have a way of revealing the cracks in systems built on assumptions. And though Elijah couldn't see it from his cramped seat, the first cracks had already begun to show. 4-0. Ban de Noi. Bang Tiang on Viet Chuang 4 Hap Dan Quan Hut Nuoi Doc Bang Jong Van Tram Lang. Kok Quan, Jong Van Qua Ka Chien Kong Qua Kich Tin Ma Ko Fan Ben Nan. Tram Lang. Nan Man Su Mao Thuan Gam Qua Van De Fan Beat Chung Tok Trong Doi Song Hong Gay Doi Tuong Nuoi Ne La Nuoi Sin Song Tai Mai Va Ko Du Tuoi Trend 65 Tuoi. ChatGPT de Noi. ChatGPT. Chapter 4, Strength in Composure. The plane moved steadily through the sky, a fragile bubble of metal and humanity suspended above the earth. Inside, life continued in the small, measured rituals of a flight, the hum of engines, the clink of glasses in first class, the faint rustle of magazines in economy. To most passengers, it was an ordinary journey. For Elijah, it was anything but. He sat in his narrow economy seat, his posture as composed as he could manage. His book remained open on his lap, though he hadn't read a single word in what felt like hours. Instead, His mind replayed the moments that had brought him here, the polite handover of his ticket, the clipped tone of the flight attendant, the long walk down the aisle under the gaze of strangers. Each detail felt small in isolation but added together. They weighed on him like an invisible burden. Elijah wasn't angry, at least. Not in the way people might expect. Anger, his father had always said, was a loud and fleeting thing. Quick to burn out and easy to dismiss. What he felt now was quieter, steadier, and far harder to ignore. It was a kind of sadness mixed with resolve. A deep awareness that the world he lived in often didn't see him for who he was but rather for what it assumed he should be. Around him, the passengers in economy seemed to have settled into their routines. A woman across the aisle offered him a small, apologetic smile. As if she sensed the injustice of what had happened but didn't know how to address it. A few rows ahead, a pair of teenagers whispered to each other, their glances darting toward him before quickly turning away. Elijah met none of their eyes. He didn't need their sympathy or their curiosity. What he needed was something they couldn't give him: fairness. At the front of the plane, Clara Mitchell moved through her duties with an efficiency that bordered on brusqueness. Her earlier conversation with the executive office weighed heavily on her, though she tried to ignore it. The young man she had moved to economy remained a shadow in her thoughts. A small but persistent reminder that she had acted on instinct rather than reason. She told herself she had done the right thing. That her gut feelings were rarely wrong. But as the minutes ticked by, the certainty she usually carried began to waver. In the galley, Robert Greene reviewed the seating manifest. His brow furrowed. He wasn't one for confrontation. But he believed in doing what was right. And what had happened to Elijah wasn't right. He stepped into the first-class cabin and approached a passenger who had witnessed the earlier exchange. After a quiet conversation, he nodded. His suspicions confirmed. Meanwhile, Elijah's phone buzzed faintly in his bag. He reached for it, careful not to disturb the passengers around him. His father's message was short but firm: "I've spoken to the airline. It's being addressed. Stay calm." Elijah let out a slow breath. He had no doubt his father would follow through. Dr. Carter was a man who chose his words carefully and wielded them like a scalpel, precise and effective. But even as he trusted his father's ability to handle the situation, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that this moment was about more than just him. It was about every person who had ever been told, in one way or another, that they didn't belong. The flight carried on. The hours passing in a strange, timeless rhythm. Elijah watched the clouds outside the window, their edges soft and dreamlike against the bright blue sky. He wondered what the world below looked like. Whether the people there felt the same kind of disconnection he felt now. Up here, everything seemed distant and unchangeable. A reminder that some battles were fought not with grand gestures but with quiet persistence. By the time the seatbelt sign dinged for landing, the tension in the air had shifted. Clara avoided Robert's gaze, her movements more subdued than before. Elijah placed his book back in his bag, its pages unread but its presence comforting. As the plane descended, he felt a strange mix of relief and anticipation. The journey wasn't over, not yet. But he knew that whatever came next, he would face it with the same calm determination that had brought him this far. The wheels touched the ground, the plane shuddering gently as it slowed to a crawl. Elijah looked out at the runway, the terminal looming in the distance. He didn't know what waited for him beyond those glass walls. But he knew one thing for certain: he wouldn't let this moment define him. Quietly, steadily, he was already preparing for what came next. 4-0. Band NOI. Bang Tiang on Viet Chuang 5 Hap Dan Quan Hut Nuoi Doc Bang Jong Van Tram Lang. Kok Quan, Jong Van Qua Ka Chien Kong Qua Kich Tin Ma Ko Fan Ben Nan. Tram Lang. Nan Man Su Mao Thuan Gam Qua Van De Fan Beat Chung Tok Trong Doi Song Hong Gay Doi Tuong Nuoi Ne La Nuoi Sin Song Tai Mai Va Ko Du Tuoi Trend 65 Tuoi. ChatGPT de Noi. ChatGPT. Chapter 5, Accountability in the Air. The plane taxied to the gate with a faint lurch. The engines humming softly as they wound down. Inside, passengers began to shift in their seats. The collective anticipation of disembarking palpable. Elijah remained still. His hands resting lightly on his closed backpack. He wasn't in a rush. The end of this flight wouldn't mean the end of the questions circling his mind or the quiet frustration pressing against his ribs. He glanced briefly toward the front of the cabin, where Clara Mitchell stood with her arms folded, her gaze fixed ahead. To anyone else, she might have appeared professional, her posture upright and her uniform crisp. But there was a rigidity in her stance that suggested unease. As though she were bracing herself for something she couldn't quite name. Behind her, Robert Greene emerged from the galley. His expression calm but firm. He moved with the measured steps of someone who understood the weight of the moment but refused to let it rush him. He had spent the final hour of the flight replaying the events in his mind, piecing together the unspoken tensions and subtle injustices that had unfolded. And now, as the plane came to a halt, he knew it was time to act. "Elijah," Robert said quietly as he approached, his voice low enough to avoid drawing attention. "I'd like to speak with you for a moment." Elijah looked up, meeting Robert's steady gaze. There was no malice or pity in the older man's eyes. Only a quiet resolve that put Elijah at ease. He nodded and rose from his seat, following Robert toward the galley. The eyes of nearby passengers followed them. But Elijah had grown used to the feeling. Once they were away from the crowd, Robert spoke. "I need to apologize for what happened earlier," he said, his tone careful but sincere. "I've looked into it. And there was no issue with your ticket. You had every right to sit in first class." Elijah didn't respond immediately. He appreciated the apology. But it didn't erase the humiliation he had endured or the knowledge that this wasn't an isolated incident. He could feel the weight of all the times he'd been doubted, questioned, or dismissed for reasons that had nothing to do with his actions. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice steady. "But it shouldn't have happened in the first place." Robert nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You're right. And I'll make sure it's addressed. This isn't just about you, it's about making sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." From the corner of his eye, Elijah saw Clara watching them, her features tight with discomfort. He didn't relish her unease. But he also didn't feel sorry for her. She had made a choice. One rooted in assumptions that she hadn't questioned. And now, she was facing the consequences of that choice. The intercom crackled as the captain announced that passengers could begin disembarking. Elijah returned to his seat and gathered his belongings, moving with the same calm precision he had shown throughout the flight. As he stepped into the aisle, he felt a hand lightly touch his arm. He turned to see the woman from across the aisle, her face kind but somber. "Good luck, young man," she said softly. "You handled that with more grace than most of us could." Elijah nodded, offering her a small smile. "Thank you," he said, the sincerity in his voice belying the weariness he felt. As he exited the plane, the cool air of the jet bridge hit him, a welcome contrast to the stale cabin atmosphere. Ahead, he saw his father waiting, his tall frame unmistakable even in the crowd. Dr. Nathan Carter's face lit up with a mixture of relief and pride as Elijah approached. He placed a firm hand on his son's shoulder. "It's been handled," his father said. His voice calm but resolute. "The airline has apologized. And they'll be issuing a formal statement." Elijah nodded, grateful for his father's unwavering support. But as they walked together toward the terminal, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. The apology was a step. But it wasn't enough to erase the deeper issue, the assumptions and biases that lingered beneath the surface of so many interactions. He thought of Clara. Of the passengers who had watched silently. And of the countless others who might find themselves in his position one day. And in that moment, he made a quiet decision. This wasn't just about reclaiming his seat. It was about making sure no one else had to fight for theirs. As father and son walked side by side, the airport bustled around them. Its energy a stark contrast to the quiet resolve in Elijah's heart. The world outside the terminal was vast and complex. But he knew one thing for certain: he would meet it with the same calm determination that had carried him through this flight. And he wouldn't stop until the skies were a little more just for everyone. 4-0. Ban de Noi. Bang Tiang on Viet Chuang 6 Hap Dan Quan Hut Nuoi Doc Bang Jong Van Tram Lang. Kok Quan, Jong Van Qua Ka Chien Kong Qua Kich Tin Ma Ko Fan Ben Nan. Tram Lang. Nan Man Su Mao Thuan Gam Qua Van De Fan Beat Chung Tok Trong Doi Song Hong Gay Doi Tuong Nuoi Ne La Nuoi Sin Song Tai Mai Va Ko Du Tuoi Trend 65 Tuoi. ChatGPT de Noi. ChatGPT. Chapter 6, A Ripple in the Air. The terminal buzzed with the steady rhythm of travel luggage wheels clattering across tiled floors. The hum of distant announcements. And the low murmur of travelers weaving through their journeys. Elijah and his father moved quietly through the crowd. Their steps unhurried. For Elijah, the energy of the airport felt oddly detached. As though he were observing it from a distance rather than participating in it. Dr. Nathan Carter, tall and composed, walked with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to navigating difficult situations. His hand rested briefly on Elijah's shoulder. A gesture of reassurance. "We'll talk with the airline representative shortly," he said. His voice was calm but carried the weight of someone who knew how to wield it when necessary. Elijah nodded. He trusted his father completely. Still, as they approached the airline's customer service desk, he couldn't help but feel the tension knotting in his chest. It wasn't just about the events on the plane, it was about what they represented. This wasn't the first time he had felt the sting of being judged by assumptions. And he knew it wouldn't be the last. At the desk, a middle-aged woman in a crisp uniform greeted them with a polite but nervous smile. "Dr. Carter." "Elijah," she began. Her voice formal. "On behalf of the airline, I want to sincerely apologize for what happened during your flight. It was unacceptable. And we are taking the matter very seriously." Nathan listened carefully. His expression unreadable. When she finished, he spoke with the measured precision of a surgeon. "Thank you for addressing this," he said. "But an apology alone doesn't undo the harm caused not just to my son, but to the principle of fairness and respect. What steps are being taken to ensure this doesn't happen again?" The woman hesitated, glancing briefly at a colleague before responding. "We are conducting an internal review. And the crew involved will undergo additional training. We are also implementing new measures to ensure incidents like this are handled appropriately in the future." Elijah watched her closely, noting the way her words seemed carefully chosen. He appreciated the effort. But he couldn't shake the feeling that the response was as much about containing the situation as it was about addressing the root cause. "Thank you," Nathan said finally, I hope those measures lead to meaningful change. As they left the desk, Elijah turned to his father. Do you think they'll actually change anything? He asked. His voice quiet but edged with doubt. Nathan stopped walking, turning to face his son. Change takes time. Elijah, he said. Sometimes it feels slow. Even futile. But it starts with moments like this when someone speaks up. When someone refuses to let things slide. You did that today. And it matters more than you think. Elijah thought about his father's words as they made their way toward the exit. He thought about the quiet moments of resistance he had witnessed in his own life, the teacher who had stood up for him when a peer dismissed his ideas. The neighbor who had corrected a passing stranger's assumptions about his family. And now this. Each moment was small. But together, they felt like something larger. Like ripples in a vast sea. As they stepped outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pavement. The air was cool and crisp, carrying with it the distant hum of jet engines. Elijah paused, looking back at the terminal behind them. It struck him how much it resembled the larger world, full of movement and possibility. Yet weighed down by invisible walls that kept some people out while letting others pass freely. I want to do more, he said suddenly. His voice firm despite its quiet tone. Nathan looked at him. His face a mixture of pride and understanding. You already have, he replied. But if you're ready to take it further, I'll stand beside you every step of the way. Elijah nodded. The knot in his chest loosening slightly. He didn't have all the answers. And he didn't know exactly what the future would hold. But he knew this, he wouldn't let the events of this flight fade into a forgotten memory. He would carry them forward. Using them to push for a world where no one else would have to prove their worth just to claim a seat they had already earned. Together, father and son walked toward the parking lot. Their steps steady against the backdrop of a world in motion. Above them, a plane ascended into the sky. Its path straight and unwavering. Elijah watched it for a moment before turning back to the road ahead. His resolve as steady as the ground beneath his feet. 4-0. Ban de Noi. Bang Tiang on Viet Chuang 7 Hap Dan Quan Hut Nuoi Doc Bang Jong Van Tram Lang. Kok Quan, Jong Van Qua Ka Chien Kong Qua Kich Tin Ma Ko Fan Ben Nan. Tram Lang. Nan Man Su Mao Thuan Gam Qua Van De Fan Beat Chung Tok Trong Doi Song Hong Gay Doi Tuong Nuoi Ne La Nuoi Sin Song Tai Mai Va Ko Du Tuoi Trend 65 Tuoi. ChatGPT de Noi. ChatGPT. Chapter 7, The Aftermath. Elijah Carter sat at the dining room table. The late evening light streaming through the windows in soft, golden hues. The house was quiet, save for the faint ticking of a clock in the next room. His father sat across from him, a cup of tea in his hands, the steam curling gently upward. They had returned home hours ago. But the weight of the day still lingered. Unspoken yet heavy. The events of the flight had sparked a series of reactions that neither of them could have fully anticipated. Nathan's phone had been buzzing with calls and messages from colleagues and friends, many of whom had heard about the incident through a quickly spreading social media post. Elijah's story shared by another passenger on the flight had gained unexpected traction, resonating with readers far beyond the confines of the airport terminal. I didn't think it would become such a big deal, Elijah said quietly, breaking the silence. His voice was steady, but there was a hint of uncertainty in it. Nathan set his cup down carefully, his eyes meeting his son's. It became a big deal because it speaks to something bigger than just today, he said. People see themselves in your story, Elijah. They see their own experiences, their own struggles. And when one person speaks out, It gives others permission to do the same. Elijah nodded slowly, his fingers tracing the edge of the wooden table. He thought about the passengers who had watched him walk down the aisle, their expressions ranging from sympathetic to indifferent. He wondered how many of them had recognized what was happening for what it was, a quiet but undeniable act of discrimination. And how many had chosen to look away, unwilling or unable to confront it. The sound of Nathan's phone vibrating on the counter pulled Elijah from his thoughts. Nathan glanced at the screen before silencing it, a small sigh escaping his lips. "The airline has issued their official apology," he said. "They've promised to implement stricter training for their staff and review their policies. Do you think that will change anything?" Elijah asked, echoing the question he had asked earlier. Nathan leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. "It's a start," he said. "But real change doesn't come from policies alone. It comes from people, individuals choosing to act differently, to challenge their assumptions, to stand up when they see something wrong." Elijah absorbed his father's words, the truth of them settling in his mind. He thought about Clara Mitchell, the flight attendant whose actions had set everything in motion. He had seen her discomfort in the moments after Robert Greene had confronted her, the way her confidence had seemed to falter. He wondered if she was thinking about him now, if she was questioning the decisions she had made and what had led her to make them. "Do you think she regrets it?" Elijah asked suddenly. Nathan's brow furrowed slightly. "Who?" "The flight attendant," Elijah said. "Clara. Do you think she regrets what she did?" Nathan was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "Regret is a complicated thing," he said finally. "Sometimes people regret the consequences of their actions more than the actions themselves. But sometimes, those consequences are what force them to reflect. Whether she regrets it or not, the hope is that she'll learn from it." Elijah nodded, though he wasn't sure if the answer fully satisfied him. He didn't want to carry resentment toward Clara. Resentment, his father often said, was a weight that only dragged down the person holding it. But he also didn't want to let her actions go unexamined. They were part of a larger pattern, one that wouldn't change unless people like her and people like the passengers who had remained silent chose to confront it. As the evening wore on, Elijah felt a quiet determination begin to take shape within him. The day's events had been painful. Yes. But they had also been clarifying. They had shown him the power of speaking up, of standing firm, even when it felt easier to let things slide. And they had reminded him that the fight for fairness wasn't just about him, it was about everyone who came after him. Everyone who deserved a seat at the table, a place in the room, a voice in the conversation. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the room in soft shadows, Elijah felt a sense of resolve he hadn't expected. The world was vast and complicated, and change often felt slow. But he knew now that even small acts of courage could ripple outward in ways he couldn't yet see. And for the first time, he felt ready to be part of that ripple. Nathan reached across the table, placing a hand on Elijah's. "You've done something important today," he said, his voice steady and warm. "And this is just the beginning." Elijah met his father's gaze and nodded. He didn't need grand gestures or dramatic victories. He needed only to keep moving forward, one quiet step at a time. 4-0. Ban de Noi. Bang Tiang on Viet Chuang 8 Hap Dan Quan Hut Nuoi Doc Bang Jong Van Tram Lang. Kok Quan, Jong Van Qua Ka Chien Kong Qua Kich Tin Ma Ko Fan Ben Nan. Tram Lang. Nan Man Su Mao Thuan Gam Qua Van De Fan Beat Chung Tok Trong Doi Song Hong Gay Doi Tuong Nuoi Ne La Nuoi Sin Song Tai Mai Va Ko Du Tuoi Trend 65 Tuoi. ChatGPT de Noi. ChatGPT. Chapter 8, A Seat for All. A week had passed since the flight. Yet the memory of it lingered with Elijah Carter. It wasn't the kind of experience that faded easily. At school, a few classmates had brought it up. Their voices filled with awe at the way his story had spread online. Strangers reached out to commend his composure. Yet beneath the recognition lay a question he couldn't quite answer: why had it taken such a moment for people to notice something so common, so routine? Elijah sat on the front porch of his house, the cool breeze brushing against his face. His father joined him, a cup of coffee in one hand and a folded newspaper in the other. Nathan placed the newspaper on the small table between them. The headline catching Elijah's eye: Airline announces reforms following incident with teen passenger. "They're saying all the right things," Nathan said after a sip of coffee. "Bias training. New oversight measures. A commitment to equity. It's a step forward." Elijah nodded, his gaze on the distant horizon. "It's good," he said. "But it's just a step." Nathan smiled faintly. "You're starting to sound like me." Elijah returned the smile, though his thoughts remained distant. He thought about the passengers on that flight, each one a witness to what had happened. He wondered if any of them had reflected on their silence. If they had questioned why it had been so easy to watch without intervening. Perhaps they had seen themselves in him. Or perhaps they had seen Clara Mitchell and thought of their own moments of judgment, their own unchecked assumptions. "Do you think people really change?" Elijah asked, his voice quiet. Nathan leaned back in his chair, the question pulling a thoughtful expression across his face. "I think people can change," he said. "But it's not always easy. It takes moments like yours to make them see what they couldn't or wouldn't before." Elijah considered this. The idea that his experience might have been a mirror for others to examine themselves. He hoped it was true, though he knew change wouldn't come quickly. It never did. But if his actions had planted even a single seed of awareness, he knew it was worth it. Later that day, Elijah and Nathan drove to the local library, where a community forum had been organized. The topic was fairness in public spaces: how biases, subtle or overt, shaped the experiences of people who didn't fit society's narrow expectations. Nathan had been invited to speak. And though Elijah hadn't planned to say anything, he felt a pull to be there. The room was modest, filled with a mix of familiar faces and strangers. The conversation flowed easily at first, each speaker sharing stories of small indignities and quiet triumphs. When Nathan finished his remarks, he gestured for Elijah to join him at the front of the room. Elijah hesitated, then rose from his seat, his step steady but unhurried. Standing before the group, he spoke plainly, his voice carrying a quiet strength. He recounted the events of the flight not with anger or dramatics, but with the same calm that had carried him through it. He described the looks, the whispers, and the weight of being asked to justify his place. And he shared what he had learned, that the fight for fairness wasn't about grand gestures but about the countless small moments that added up to something larger. When he finished, the room was silent for a beat, the weight of his words settling over the audience. Then, one by one, people began to nod, their faces marked by recognition and quiet understanding. On the drive home, Elijah felt lighter, though the work ahead still felt vast. He looked at his father, who had always carried himself with the same steady grace Elijah now aspired to. "Do you think we'll ever get there?" Elijah asked, breaking the comfortable silence. Nathan's hands stayed steady on the wheel as he answered. "Not all at once," he said, "but step by step. With voices like yours." We'll get closer. Elijah turned his gaze back to the road ahead. The sky above painted in the soft hues of twilight. He didn't know what the future held. But he knew he was ready to face it with patience. With resolve. And with the quiet belief that change was possible. No matter how slow it might seem. As the car moved steadily forward, Elijah felt a sense of purpose settle within him. It wasn't about one flight or one apology, it was about every seat. Every space. Every moment where someone was made to feel less than they were. And he was determined to make sure no one had to face that alone.